Hello, everyone. I'm very excited to welcome everyone to this session titled Advancing Biosecurity and Effective Altruism in Low Resource Settings with Peter Babigumira Ahabwe. I'm Belle, and I'll be your MC for this session. So following Peter's presentation, we'll move on to a live Q&A session where Peter will respond to your questions. So please do submit your questions for Peter through the swap card live discussion feature in the questions tab. Then after 45 minutes, we'll bring the session to a close. But for now, I would like to introduce Peter. So Peter is a global health security and diplomacy expert specializing in biosecurity. He plays pivotal roles at the Uganda Public Health Emergency Operations Center and the Infectious Diseases Institute. As the Border Health Technical Lead, Epidemic Intelligence Analyst, and friend of the chair for the Working Group on Strengthening the Biological Weapons Convention, Peter has consistently championed biosecurity initiatives in Uganda and on the global stage. Peter is also an alumnus of Emerging Leaders in Biosecurity Initiative and Youth for Biosecurity programs. He has a Bachelor of Pharmacy and has further honed his skills with training in global diplomacy, economic evaluation in global health, and program management. He was involved in leadership roles in the Ebola virus disease rapid risk assessment, incident management teams for EVD and COVID-19, and as a technical advisor for various health security projects. Peter's fervor for education and biosecurity is evident in his contributions to developing educational curriculum. He was instrumental in the design of and deployment of Act Like a Pro, a scenario-based e-learning initiative for the next generation of biosecurity learners funded by the Nuclear Threat Initiative. And lastly, Peter's publications span topics from Ebola outbreak preparedness to antimicrobial stewardship in sub-Saharan Africa. He is a member of several professional societies and networks, including the Emergency Care Society Uganda, the European Society of Clinical Microbiology and Infectious Diseases, and the Global Health Security Network. Peter, on to you.
Thank you so much, Bill, and good morning, good evening, good afternoon to everyone wherever you are. So I'm making this presentation to you today as an EA practitioner, second, but first as a public health expert. So a lot of you are very technical in the EA sense. So forgive me for the areas where my stuff doesn't hold together in that sense. But for me, my foray into effective altruism was to solve a problem. So in using the principles, it's less about the subject matter and more about how I can apply them to solve the problem. So just take it with a big handful of salt when I say something wrong or misplaced. I think the lesson is how do you apply the principles. So moving on, in this first picture, this picture was taken in 2016 at the launch of the Uganda National Biosafety and Biosecurity Association. And in this picture, you can see members of the armed forces, members of police, members of health, members of agriculture, wildlife, and environment. Many of us call this concept One Health. Others call it linking public health and security. But basically, for me, what I picked from EA side is community development. No matter what cause area you're working in effective altruism, you have to, the very first thing is you have to build a community wherever you are, whether it's in Vietnam or Uganda or in San Francisco. You don't get the EA light and then put it under your bed where it can't shine. Like you will not achieve much there. So the way this is going to go, I'm going to go through some definitions, not really that they are standard definitions, but just to frame the conversation downstream. Then just for me, what my rough understanding of EA, and then the significance of biosecurity. Then we'll look at Uganda's biosecurity landscape, we'll look at the healthcare system, and not again from the sense of conventional healthcare, but in the context of biosecurity. We'll look at the challenges. Then we'll look at strategy, like the approach that Uganda has used towards dealing with biosecurity, not really as a national document, but yes. And then finally, just some future direction, implementing EA in biosecurity and some thoughts, and then we'll have the Q&A. So who am I? You can see from the first picture, I'm collecting antimicrobial resistance, drug consumption, and use data in hospital in the field, and the one below that I'm putting up some stewardship posters. My first foray into health security was doing antimicrobial resistance because I was a pharmacist. And from doing that kind of disease surveillance for antimicrobial resistance, we went into capacity building, which is the antimicrobial stewardship initiative. But once you really get into work in the hospital, you really now become an all-rounder because the tools remain the same. Eventually, my work moved on to outbreaks in the lower right. You can see that is a deep on the border between Uganda and Rwanda, and we were doing a risk assessment for Ebola. And then finally, the mid picture in the middle was really the use of digital tools. This is what used to be called TweetDeck, but for some reasons disappeared. But TweetDeck is something I used a lot in my disease surveillance days before getting more bogged down with policy. And I can tell you that it was 7th of January 2020 when the first reports coming out of Wuhan were streaming on Twitter that we had a deck up at the Emergency Operations Center, and I told them it's here. That's the pandemic, because for 2 years before we'd been doing preparedness. So that's who I am, pretty much an all-rounder. Yeah. So global catastrophic biological risks can be defined many ways, but basically, these are events that are caused by biological agents that could negatively and permanently alter the long-term trajectory of humanity or result in human extinction. So for those of you from a health background, we are not dealing with cholera, unfortunately. I always try to explain to folks the difference between the catastrophic versus the normal pandemic risks. It's not just chalking it down to percentage, case fatality ratios, and how many people have you died, but what are those sequelae of the epidemic? So you find diseases like Ebola will kill 2, 3 people, but then cost billions of dollars in cleanup, versus a disease like cholera, which may spread to very many places and then have low cost interventions like water, sanitation, and hygiene. So the likely consequence. So for GCBRs, again, here we are looking at that they would lead to great suffering, loss of life, and sustained damage to national governments, international relationships, economies, societal stability, or global security. Now, there are 3 scenarios, and the probability increases. So this is just a spectrum. From my colleague, I got this from my colleague, and the way she described it, I loved it, was the probability reduces, but the impact is highest. So when you go from the spectrum of natural pandemics to accidental release to deliberate attacks, you end up with low probability but high impact events. So with natural pandemics, you have the most example we know. The jury's still out on COVID, so I'll leave that out. But for others, for plague in the past and some of the choleras and the 1918 influenzas. But then for accidental release as well, we have natural pathogens being released into the wild, but these eventually follow natural patterns. But for engineered pathogens in the wild, you really worry about them because of the effects of the modifications. And then finally, for a deliberate attack with a modified pathogen. So lab accident can be defined broadly, but one of the examples is the 1977 Russian flu that infected mostly those aged 25, and you had the sequenced H1N1 strains from the 1950s. So engineered pathogens, of course, I've hinted on that. So dual research is another important thing for consideration. This is just an example of how dual use researches have had cross-cutting effects, whereby, I mean, like in the first case, you look at enhancing harmful consequences of a biological agent or toxin. And here, a published example was creating a pathogenic simian immunodeficiency virus. And for many of us in areas affected by HIV, we can just imagine the impact that if immunodeficiency viruses can be modified and can have as devastating effects as HIV, but working as fast as COVID, it just leaves a lot to worry. So an example of deliberate releases is the Doomsday Cult, Aum, Shinrikyo, led by Shoko Asahara, and after experimenting with biological agents, they opted for chemical agents because luckily it was too expensive and there were a lot of barriers. But as we see in this presentation, the reality has changed a lot in this space. So for EA, for me, EA is really about using evidence and reason to figure out how to benefit others as much as possible and taking actions on that basis. And it involves prioritizing interventions that are demonstrably effective, scalable, and address neglected issues. In global health, that means focusing resources where they make the biggest difference. And EA challenges us to think critically about how we can do the most good with the resources we have. It's about combining compassion with critical thinking and data-driven strategies. So just to frame again with the definitions, the threat landscape, CBRN, that is chemical, biological, radionuclear threats as a whole, are usually handled in one bucket. That means, especially in low resource settings, you're not going to come and say, oh, I want to do biosecurity only. You'll find many countries just have one office or one department or one agency dealing with all CBRN threats. So that means chemical, biological, radionuclear. But how does the risk mapping change? One of the issues is right now in the world, we've had a very huge weakening of international regimes against CBRN weapons. And these are the different treaties. And even we are seeing non-state actors and state actors getting interested in increasing on their stockpiles, withdrawing from treaties. Now, for the non-state actors, they have very many limitations, and the probability of a terrorist attack involving CBRN agent remains low. And you should never try to convince someone with a special training or specialization in terrorism that it's a high probability event. The issue is the impact is too large. That's why we have to keep a pulse on it or a finger on it. Now, chemical agents are more popular because it's easier to work with, but similarly, the regime for control of chemical agents is much more robust, stronger, and clearer with its own international institution. Biology is the problem child. It's very hard to categorize between activities meant for good and activities meant for bad. Another issue you have that separates these things is the development complexity, whereby for chemical agents, non-state actors may easily access the agents themselves, and then they'll be able to make homemade explosives, or they'll be able to pilfer or divert toxic industrial chemicals. Now, access to biological agents and toxins is tricky. It's not entirely possible, but it's also not entirely impossible. As we saw this year in Sudan during the civil war, a lab was taken over by the warring parties, and they had threats to use the material in those labs to conduct biological attacks. And for us, this is a very disturbing trend because previously we've had a lot of insurgencies, civil wars, but how often do you find the warring parties referring to the use of biological agents? So for non-state actors, usually they'll have that first gap. They'll need leadership support, technical expertise, access to materials, and a safe haven. Now, this is especially true in low resource settings. I know a lot of folks, when they talk about synthetic biology, they say the costs have become low, and a kid in his mom's garage can literally synthesize DNA. But in many low resource settings, that is not the reality. You'd need very strong leadership support and financing and access to knowledge and skills and materials. And then, of course, if your country does not deal with or produce or use nuclear materials, and hence you have lack of access to fissile material, you almost have a zero threat of nuclear attacks by terrorists. So this is why we see that biological agents and toxins really come out around there. So going straight into the presentation. So biosecurity in general, so this is a definition that is trying to make everyone happy. Who's everyone? The folks who are dealing with biodiversity and the Nagoya Protocol, the folks dealing with bioeconomy and synthetic biology, the vets who deal with animals and biosecurity in that sense, human biosecurity. So basically, measures aimed at preventing spread of disease, pests, or invasive species that can harm humans, agriculture, and biodiversity. And in our globalized world, it's not just a local issue, but it's a global one. Diseases know no borders. And low resource settings face unique challenges, often lacking infrastructure and resources needed for effective disease surveillance and response. And as we see during my presentation, you see some of the local initiatives Uganda has adopted to try and achieve the same level of efficiency. So in these settings offer unique opportunities for impactful interventions guided by EA, especially if you're really looking about a long-termism, from a long-term view, and you're saying you can't define your biosecurity in the context of a high-income country with all its resources. Because if you had a GCBR, a global catastrophic biological risk, with time, there would be progressive downgrading of the general global civilization and its infrastructure. So rather than developing our interventions from the point of view of high resource and high income settings, we need to say what's the minimum viable way of doing this in every setting, such that when it comes to higher resource settings, we can upscale the interventions, but in lower resource settings, we can also still achieve effectiveness. So I feel like Uganda does present this great opportunity and a compelling case. So what is our biosecurity landscape? Of course, Uganda's health system faces several challenges, including limited resources, shortage of health care professionals, and uneven distribution of services. And despite this, Uganda has made strides. The government, along with various NGOs, plays a critical role in healthcare delivery and disease prevention. And this is why, for me, I think EA principles are needed today, because for many countries, they use philanthropy plays a big role in their ability to deliver healthcare. So that means we need to have EA built in from the ground. Traditional healthcare practices often coexist with modern medical approaches, offering a unique healthcare landscape as well. And the best example for this I can give is Covidex in Uganda. A lot of people use Covidex for prophylaxis and treatment of COVID. But of course, these traditional products always faced hurdles in the international community with stigma, authorization, and the like. So if we are truly being about effectiveness, that means even big pharma for big pharma to adopt EA values, they need to also look at traditional medicine approaches in the Southeast Asia, in South America, and in Africa. So understanding this context is essential for discussing biosecurity in Uganda. So what are the challenges? So there are two types of biosecurity. I want to make a broad thing, right? So there's what I call non-GCBR biosecurity, and then there's biosecurity. So the broad health interventions, minimizing loss of life and all that, is where we build from first, because GCBRs don't come walking around every day. They So before we think of building systems resilient to GCBR, we need to ask ourselves, are current systems already resilient to the current healthcare challenges so that we can scale up? So, for example, if you don't have seasonal influenza vaccination programs in a country and you're investing in some kind of plan to have rapid scale up in pandemic influenza, vaccine hesitancy will knock you off from that word go because no one is used to this vaccination program. So we can't think about building systems for global catastrophic risks when there are no systems for these normal ones. So Uganda has struggled with infectious diseases like HIV, TB, malaria. And yes, it's true, in 2023, malaria is still a problem in Africa, you know, as well as emerging zoonotic diseases. Of course, our interest in zoonotic diseases is because of their ability to spill over to human diseases. So the prevalences of zoonotic diseases such as Ebola and Marburg pose a significant public health risk. Antimicrobial resistance is an escalating concern. I want to look at HIV and antimicrobial resistance as slow-moving pandemics. Because they are slow-moving, very many people ignore them and don't want to deal with them. But by the time, they remind me of climate change. You think you have so much time, and then every time you check in, it goes from now we needed $3 billion, now we need $100 billion. Maybe the next time we need $3 trillion. So HIV and AMR are very low-key pandemics that are constantly ravaging. So socioeconomic factors, including poverty, urbanization, exacerbate these biosecurity challenges. So what about Uganda's biosecurity approach? Uganda's biodefense or biosecurity approach serves as a case study showing the application of EA in real world. So this approach aims to strengthen Uganda's capacity to prevent, detect, and respond to biological threats. It involves collaboration among government agencies, international partners, and local communities. And the approach's development, of course, not that people came and said we are EA people and we are using EA principles, but at the heart of it all, it was guided by principles of cost effectiveness and evidence-based decision-making. Its implementation offers valuable insights into advancing biosecurity in low-resource settings. So this slide summarizes the approach. In 2017, Uganda completed its joint external evaluation of its international health regulation capacities. So that is the JEE mission where we start from on the slide. But ever since then, we've already submitted annual reporting, that's state-party annual reporting. Now, the goal of these constant evaluations is to see the progress being made. And this progress doesn't just only look at the actual interventions, but it also tries to cost them. Now, when you cost and understand, you come up with what we call the National Action Plan for Health Security. So this is the plan I was telling you that is really based on EA principles, because it looks at what are the most low-hanging, cost-effective approaches that can achieve health security. Now, when the plan is in action, it uses a One Health approach, and I told you this one uses actors from all areas. To test the plan, we use simulation exercises, because when you're dealing with health security, it's not just numbers and figures and projections. You have to actually test the system to see its strength and resilience. And then if an event happens, you have an outbreak, you do an after-action review. And of course, there are other assessments and evaluations, such as the previous pathways done by the World Organization for Animal Health. The Food and Agriculture Organization also has its joint risk assessment that harmonizes several. And there are several others, cost effectiveness studies and all that. But basically, at the end of the day is we go back into this cycle again. So just last month, we completed our second joint external evaluation, and we have embarked on doing our next national action plan for health security. The same process was completed for antimicrobial resistance. So that's the approach. So in summary, what are the capacities? Basically, at the heart of it all, coordination through an emergency operations center, and we also have regional ones. Then real-time information system to ensure that surveillance and response is in real time. And then having a nationwide nationwide lab network. Lab is the foundational capacity of public health emergency response. If you don't have a lab, if you can't do testing, if you can't do, it's what's the point of surveillance? You pick after people, you find out they're sick and you can't do tests to confirm. So labs are a very central point of these initiatives. Now, when you do actually come to a response, you find yourself in a situation whereby we use this mechanism.
Sorry, Peter. I think you're
Oh,
muted.
sorry. Yeah, sorry, I
Yes, you're
went on
back.
mute.
No
Yeah.
worries.
So I was saying that at the heart of public health response is coordination. When you have the coordination system in place, you have case management. So this supports the function of establishing the health facilities and the treatment facilities. You have surveillance, epidemiology, and the lab function. So this is that constant detection capacity, logistics and security, social mobilization, and health education. This is a model we have found that works outbreak to outbreak. This is a model that works. It's just modifying the scale and the size of the teams that we found that changes over time. So I want to also show you another important aspect. So when you're designing programs, you need to look at we have a national level, then we have district level, then we have subcommittees, then we go down to the sub-county, the villages, and then we work with these thought opinion leaders in those villages. Why? Because you have to have a community-led response, and you can never design interventions without the communities who are going to be responsible for them. It's like I told you, when you're going to work with a pandemic or a GCBR or something of the like, how are you going to start telling people tomorrow, oh, there's a GCBR, let's all get vaccinated, when at the very grassroots, the communities don't even know or trust these programs. So now that what I've first shown you, that's what happens in the country. Now, what about at the larger level when it comes to the mitigating the biological risks? When it comes to mitigating the biological risks, so we have the risks from state parties and the risks from non-state actors. Now, for state parties, of course, many low-resource countries don't really, first of all, don't even like permanent members on the Security Council or anything. So you have very little way or control over the opinions and views of state parties. But what can we do in this case? And I want to credit I got this from a paper by Dr. Jenny Yassi, Shaping Intent. By actively participating in the international community, and you can actively shape the intent and deter the powerful states per se, or those states who are engaging in these destructive weapons and their research and all that stuff. You can discourage them by having global public opinion against these things. And then, of course, for non-state actors, it's constraining their capabilities. So in the area of shaping intent, there are two things we want to do: preventing misperceptions and arms racing. And that is, for example, is through transparency, like the Biological Convention has a component of confidence building measures. And just a week from now, 2 weeks from now, there will be this reopening the conversation on verification of the treaty after over 20 years. And then for deterring bioweapon development and use, it's important to develop mechanisms for attribution. If people know that systems are in place to pin them, to hold them accountable and responsible for use of biological weapons, they are less likely to do them. Think of it like if you see cameras in a supermarket, like 90% of the people who would have done some theft will be deterred just because they know that they can be attributed to doing the crime. And then finally, accountability by the different member states holding people accountable. So what are some of the interventions You can, for the labs, you can reduce risks of accidents by strengthening biosecurity, avoiding excessively risky research. And in Uganda, what we have is a strong biosecurity system, and we have a biosecurity association. We have a biosecurity program at the national level, but also to prevent risky research, our National Council of Science and Technology has set up institutional biosecurity committees and also trained the institutional review boards on the dual use, and also dual use declaration is part of the research process. Then, of course, we actively prevent malicious actors from exploiting and misusing the items by controlling access and services. And we also try to prevent info hazards in publication. Sorry, Kim. I think my network is, and sorry, Bell. So, there are different kinds of stakeholders. We don't only have national stakeholders, we also have larger stakeholders like the Africa Centers for Disease Control. We have international organizations. We have different foundations, and we also have private sector. We also have academia and research. We have policymakers, healthcare providers, and then also, like I said, community. Community is a very important thing. There's this, if some of you know IGEM, we keep a close relationship with the IGEM teams, trying to make sure we find a way of incorporating what they do and how they work within our landscape. And credit to my sister Yemisi for this format of presenting the slides. So, how are the principles in practice? Just to summarize, we have data-driven approaches. Like I told you, data is generated from the surveillance systems and the like. Then you have public health pharmacists and other public health people play a role in the strategy, like, for example, from managing supplies to participating in disease surveillance. But we also have other actors. We have doctors, nurses, we have lab people. Then increasingly, we are getting a lot of folks who come out from the social side, because we realize a lot of the issues are related to policy. And of course, challenges include those constraints that I mentioned before, like resource constraints and ensuring community engagement. One of the issues we have because of limited staff is high turnover of staff, and colleagues keep changing jobs and moving to new departments. So despite these challenges, I feel like the approach has achieved notable success, demonstrating the value of an EA-guided approach. So someone is asking himself, why does he keep saying this is an EA-guided approach? That's a cookie. It's a nugget for the people who stay till the end of the presentation. So I want to emphasize on Uganda and the Biological Weapons Convention. So like I told you, we've looked at the risks, we've looked at the strategies, we've looked at what we're doing in country to deal with the normal threats. So what can a low resource country do with trying to shape intent? For us, Uganda, it's a Biological Weapons Convention. It's something which we acceded to in 1992. And also, we're party to the Geneva Protocol. And we last submitted a confidence building measure report in 1996. But this is really because of logistical challenges. We contribute 0.01% of their budget, and we have no arrears. We also have ongoing projects with them and our national focal point is Kanokris, Batize, Bagamba. So what are the tangible things we've done? This is just a recap of the past year alone. We've participated in a regional workshop with other member states and shared our experiences. The Intergovernmental Authority for Development, I got together with the United Nations Office of Disarmament Affairs, hosted a regional workshop on Resolution 1540, which mainly looks at the non-state actor component. And I told you, non-state actor component is one of the ones we're looking at. So we attended that meeting, and we also had bilaterals with the VWC team. Our national focal point participated in a meeting in May with other national focal points. This is again what I told you, community building. We try to make sure we have strong relationships with other people working in the Biological Weapons Convention. In Geneva, we participated in a working lunch that was had with African permanent missions. And even our ambassador and defense attaché have visited the ISU a little too much, if I may say, because we always want to make sure that they have all the support and need. And, sometimes, you may take it for granted, but just having that strong political support and engagement and knowing you have a partner out there who's showing people that you're working hard and relevant is important. So we try to do that. The Ninth Review Committee did start a working group on strengthening the Biological Weapons Convention. Uganda forwarded 4 facilitators to this process, 1 on national implementation, 2 on science and 2 on national implementation and 2 on science and technology. So these are the facilitators who are supported. And in the first photo, you can see we're having a bilateral meeting with the chair of the working group and his team, Ambassador Dami of Brazil. And this is the defense attaché with one of the facilitators of SRT attending the meeting. So also, this is another courtesy visit that was had just recently with the ISU. So just again to show that for us, we believe that, and we want to call on all countries really to participate strongly in these international regimes and to support the implementation supporting into international bodies that run them, because they need the support, they need the help, they need to stay relevant, and they really help a lot in shaping the intent. These were 3 Ugandans who were showcased at the Women in the Biological Weapons Convention exhibit. One of them is in part of our CBRN unit in the Army. One of them is head of labs at one of the leading research institutions. And the other is the co-founder of the Synthetic Bio Africa and the executive director of New Bioscience. So as you can see, gender is a very important part of Uganda's engagement strategy. Did you know that if you just got all the women to work, you'd solve many of our, work shortages? So we need to change the way we think about the role of women and create conducive environments by which women can participate in meetings like this, providing a creche, virtual options, things like that. Buy tickets for their babies if they are newborns. I mean, let's be open-minded. So youth engagement is another important point. This is a fuzzy picture. I'll share a clearer one of the youth for Biosec winners meeting with the national delegation along the sides of the working group meeting, the fellows rather, and Ugandans have participated in at least 3 iterations of this. There's the Emerging Leaders in Biosecurity initiative as well, and we have Ugandans who have participated in this as well for at least the last 3 iterations. And I feel like this is a very good initiative that actually has strong support from the EA community, if some of you didn't know. But yeah. So if I look at the outcomes, this approach for me, I feel, has been very good because there's been an enhancement in emergency response capability, reducing the time to respond just by trying to capitalize on where your strengths are greatest and where the costs are least has been helpful. Working with communities, we have what we call village health teams, guys who go door to door, checking on people, are they sick, have they traveled, and things like that. Public health awareness campaigns have increased community knowledge and participation in disease prevention. Uganda is a place where we work with communities. That one I can't leave out. And of course, the cost effectiveness has been key to success because we've continued to receive support from funders and philanthropy. There's a good business case for working in Uganda. And colleagues, not as a threat, but as a reminder, Uganda is home to very many diseases of pandemic potential. It's definitely an area whereby, and yet, meanwhile, not that Uganda has never had a spillover of a pandemic or an epidemic disease ever since time immemorial, which just shows that, you get a good bang for your buck when you invest in in strengthening the system here. So future direction and strategies. So I think to further integrate EA in biosecurity, like I told you first, we've been looking at synthetic biology and AI. We need to embrace technology and innovation, especially in disease surveillance and data analysis. We need to build, and this one, it seems like, of course, every slide will say this, but I mean specifically for low resource settings. Don't envision this big server with like 20,000 desktops and everything. We need to have a way in which science and technology can operate in low resource settings. Building strong public-private partnerships is important. Public-private partnership is until COVID, this was an area where very many people always presumed that public health was for public institutions and philanthropy. So public health communication strategies must be tailored to local context. In Uganda, we have a saying here, you don't sit in Kampala, which is our capital, and make posters for over 200 languages. You need to go down with the communities and work with them. Continuous evaluation and adaptation are key to ensuring biosecurity strategies remain relevant, and collaboration across disciplines and borders is essential for addressing global community challenges. So the global health implications, the principles of EA have far-reaching implications beyond biosecurity. Proactive and preventive approaches in biosecurity can significantly reduce the global burden. I think you've noticed most of Uganda's efforts are about being proactive and prevention rather than response. Then diverse sectors have to be brought on board. What I said, the One Health. International collaboration and knowledge sharing are vital, and ongoing research and innovation are crucial to staying ahead of the threats. So in conclusion, this one I don't have a slide for it, but I want to wrap everything up together. So why does Peter keep saying EA principles, EA principles, EA principles? So in 2019, I had the privilege of attending the Biological Weapons Convention. And when I attended this meeting, for me, it really sparked an interest in my mind about rethinking biosecurity, because I'd worked a lot at the country level and in the lower regions, subnational levels. So I applied to the Emerging Leaders in Biosecurity Fellowship with John Hopkins, which, like I told some of you, sponsored through EA. And some of the guys, I noticed a lot of the work being done in the space of GCBRs was closely tied with EA community. And a lot of the first slides that I read as I educated myself on this topic were from presentations made at EAGX or EA, in the different places. So for me, I can tell you for a fact that the effective altruism, for me, that's why I picked an interest in it. I did the intro course. I really liked the approaches. So I started reading more from EA thinkers than non-EA thinkers. Maybe I'm right, maybe I'm wrong. I'm sorry, So it's not like, oh, go read this peer review person who has this. So I really went out, and I think you've noticed a lot of the people in my slides are really the people from the EA community. So for me, embracing those principles and values of effective altruism shaped how I approached community building in Uganda. I reached out to the folks in Geneva. We got to meet. I reached out to folks who have done fellowships, and I've been one of the key building blocks of the biosecurity community. And I've had the privilege to shape our values, our beliefs, and our approaches against EA principles without even one person knowing about EA or something like that. Now, I've also had the privilege of mentoring some people who really pick an interest and tell me, hey, I'm really interested in how you think and how you reason, and I point them in EA. I have one mentee who has really done a lot in that area, but not a lot. So when you're thinking about using EA in low resource settings, don't be so rigid that, oh, I'll go to a university and start an EA club. No, it can just be a biosecurity club. And the principles are what's important, not really the branding and the labeling. But also for folks who do programs and program evaluation, that means when you're thinking about the impact of EA around the world, don't just go and Google EA and then look at if people have said the word EA. you have to think of innovative ways of identifying if the EA community are having spillover effects in other areas. So, Belle, I want to stop there and allow some questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Peter, for the comprehensive sharing on the biosecurity challenges in the unique context of Uganda, and for the important reminder as well as to how we implement EA principles in real life. So, moving on to the Q&A, I'm mindful that we have a few minutes. So, take the opportunity to please ask Peter your questions. Let's start off with Joe. So Joe asked, you mentioned that because there isn't a seasonal flu vaccination system in place, it will be more difficult to get a system in place for an emergent pandemic. But COVID works as a great case study for this. And they asked, if there is research being done on the specific challenges that were involved for getting the COVID vaccine rolled out in Uganda or other low resource settings, and what were the biggest hurdles that we may be able to mitigate in advance.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm going to go off script and just be very blunt. A lot of the success in COVID vaccination was coercive rather than um, accepting. It's not that people accepted the vaccine. People had to. They couldn't access public transport. They couldn't fly planes. They couldn't go to schools. So I think that's a very wrong example. I think any studies in vaccination need to look at seasonal influenza. I have friends in the US who are 50-50. Some do it, some don't. Some would rather stick it out with a cold. I want people to study seasonal influenza because it's the true definition of market forces. There's no coercion. No one will ask you for a seasonal influenza vaccination card to fly a plane. But for many of us, you can't say that for COVID. I think it's the wrong example. And I think it's also a cautionary tale that while that worked for COVID, it may not always work, especially in a GCBR when government has collapsed and there's low levels of trust. I dare you to believe vaccination will be well adopted. And for me, it would be sad really for the zombie movie to end and you come up with the vaccine and then all the healthy people are like, yeah, we'll try our luck with the zombies. We don't trust the vaccine. And I can give you an example. I want some of you to go without biasing you and read about the new vaccine deployment for malaria and see how well that's been doing. Because that's happening right now, and see the issues and the information, the hesitancy. That for me is a very relevant example because of course there's no requirement for it for travelers and what, but you go and read about the malaria.
Awesome. I think that's pretty insightful as well. Just a reminder that Peter will be having an after office hour session, so please feel free to direct any other questions you may have in that. And with that, this concludes the session. Have a great conference and thanks for watching.